starting time today for the webinar. I'm just going to start out with a few housekeeping notes. So I want you all to know that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available afterwards on the European Polar Board's YouTube page, and we'll also have a link to that from the Arctic Science Ministerial website. We'll have a Q&A hopefully at the end, time permitting. So if you have questions that come up during the series, you can type them into the Q&A box down at the bottom. If you have any technical issues, you can type that into the chat box, but just please be aware if you have questions, type those into the Q&A box. And then we'll answer all of the questions at the end. We'll read them aloud and answer them to the best of our ability. I would like to keep the questions relevant to this webinar series. So if you have broader questions about ASM3 in general, you can always email the Arctic Science Ministerial Organizing Committee, and that email address will be available at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, to start off, we have Ásgerður Kjartansdóttir from the Icelandic Ministry of Education, Science and Culture, and she's going to start this webinar.
Yes, hello. On behalf of the Arctic Science Ministerial Organizing Committee and the European Polar Board, I would like to warmly welcome you all to this first ASM webinar. The aim of the webinar series is to keep the ASM science process ongoing despite the current pandemic. The registration to the webinar exceeded our highest expectations, and we are glad to be welcoming participants from around the world. Today you will be introduced to the idea behind the series and how it will be linked to the process leading up to the Third Arctic Science Ministerial in Tokyo in May next year. Without further ado, I would like to welcome the Icelandic Minister for Education, Science and Culture, Lilja Alfreðsdóttir, to give her opening remarks. Dear colleagues, I am extremely excited to be able to open the first webinar in our ASM3 webinar series. I would like to thank our ASM3 Organizing Committee and Science Advisory Board making this series a reality, and thank you to our friends at the European Polar Board for supporting this series. I understand that we have participants from Alaska to Greenland, across Europe and North America, as well as participants who are staying up very late in Japan, South Korea, and annyeonghaseyo, India and China, ni hao. And thank you all for joining us, kicking off the ASM3 webinar series. I'm truly glad that you can join us today. What I will discuss here in my opening remarks, I will, number one, talk about the global relevance of Arctic science, and then kind of go into our values, what we think is so important that we are all here working on Arctic affairs in the spirit of cooperation, inclusiveness, transparency, and innovation, or as we call it, CITI. Dear friends, throughout the planning process of the ASM3, we've been so grateful to work with our exceptional partners in Japan. Both of our countries have been engaged for many decades in Arctic research. And while the Arctic is our backyard here in Iceland, for Japan to have been engaged for decades in Arctic science research is truly admirable and shows that the Arctic is a place of global relevance. The Third Arctic Science Ministerial science is focused on, and we have contributions from 28 countries and governments, 16 international science organizations, and 6 indigenous peoples organizations. Clearly, the scientific research happening in the Arctic has a global reach, which is extremely important. As I mentioned, basically the values and what we're focusing on is cooperation, inclusiveness, transparency, and innovation. When we were planning the process for ASM3 beginning in 2018 with our partners in Japan, we did not foresee what challenges we would face as a global community in the year 2020. And I can tell you, my 11-year-old daughter, she's always asking me, when will this year be finished, Mom? But I tell her we should be grateful that we are in good health, and we should all focus on kind of reaching out to everyone and focus on that science has never, ever been as important as it is in our global community, because we're all waiting for, will we have a vaccine? Will there be a cure? And I don't think that the scientific community, which I am addressing today, would ever imagine that everyone would be looking at how research in developing a vaccine and testing would move the stock markets across the world. But the same thing applies to the Arctic. The Arctic is of same importance because of its global reach. So, as I said, I think that we have and we can achieve a lot with science, and science should bring us together. Our organizing committee and the Science Advisory Board have been engaged in a long science process to try to get kind of the best of the international cooperation in science research. We want to learn from each other, and we want to inspire each other. We want science to bring us together. We need strong policies founded in good, clear, well-supporting science, because the challenges that we face today with the melting glaciers, forest fires across the Arctic Circle, rising sea levels, and community displacement are immense. And as with the COVID-19, the solution will be found in science. And I am confident that we can meet these challenges if we work together to find innovative and collaborative solutions. To have a good science to support good policies, we need cooperation. Cooperation is built on having an inclusive, transparent scientific process that drives innovation. These challenging times that we're living in, but they are also inspiring times. The challenge that we face should inspire all of us to work together and come up with solutions that we thought would never be possible. Our hope is that each Arctic Science Ministerial relationships between policymakers, researchers, and Arctic residents develops and becomes richer. The global climate crisis is an incredible, challenging problem that faces both Arctic and non-Arctic people. One that we cannot face without shared foundation and science-driven policy. Although we have a delayed holding the ministerial until May 2021, the work of the Arctic Science Ministerial is going forward. We look forward to engaging with all Arctic science stakeholders throughout this webinar series in the lead up to the ministerial meeting in Tokyo. While our capacity for global audience at the ministerial meeting is quite limited, this webinar series gives us the opportunity to share the inspiring science that comes out of this process with all of us in free, public, and open format. I would like to end by saying I thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to engaging throughout the webinar series. And have all a great day, and I look forward to seeing you all in person, hopefully shortly. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the minister. We're really grateful to have her here to open this series. Throughout the challenges that have presented all of us in 2020, our minister has been determined to keep up the momentum for ASM3. And this webinar series really is a testament to her determination to keep going. So really, this is an introductory webinar that's intended to give an overview of the Arctic Science Ministerial process and to give you sort of a glimpse into the upcoming webinars in the series. So as this webinar is open to the public, we might have many participants who are not too familiar with the Arctic Science Ministerial. And as this is only the third Arctic Science Ministerial, you understand that this is actually a relatively new meeting. So we've asked two members from our Science Advisory Board, Fran Ulmer and Karin Lokte, to give us an overview of the first and second Arctic Science Ministerial. After that, just to give an overview of the actual ASM3 process, we have two members from our ASM3 Organizing Committee joining us. That's Hajime Kimura from the Japanese Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, and Tetsuo Sueyoshi from the Japanese National Institute of Polar Research. After that, I'll be back to give an overview of the upcoming webinars in this series, and then we'll end, hopefully time permitting, with a short Q&A. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, if you have questions relevant to the webinar series, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll try our best to answer them at the end. Any further questions beyond the ASM3 webinar series can be sent directly to the ASM3 Organizing Committee. And as I said at the top, you can find our email at the end of this presentation. Really, we're able to do this webinar series because of our cooperation with the European Polar Board. So we are so grateful for their help in putting this series together. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Renuka Bada from the European Polar Board to sort of give a brief introduction of the European Polar Board.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Just give me a second while I share my slide. Brilliant. Well, thank you all, and I join everyone else in welcoming you for this ASM3 webinar series. It is our complete pleasure to co-organize it with you and host it for the ASM3 organizers. My name is Renuka Bade, and I work as the Executive Secretary of the European Polar Board. I just want to give you a very quick flavor of what the EPB is and what it does before we launch into the first episode of this webinar series. The EPB was formed in 1995 and has been hosted in the Netherlands since 2015. So, as you can see, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and I ask you to join us in our celebrations for not just the last successful 25 years, but also maybe the next 25 years too. The EPB's main mission is to promote, cooperate, coordinate and advance European research in the high latitudes by providing a collaborative platform for polar researchers. We work with a range of partners, international and European organizations working in the polar regions. We also work with many international entities like the ASM3, for example, like this with this webinar series. We have a composite and a strong membership from within Europe. We have 25 member organizations from 19 countries. And we are one of the few organizations that work on both the Arctic and Antarctic regions. EPB has worked extensively to ensure that a lot of our work is available freely online, and we have quite an active YouTube channel where you will also be able to find the recordings from this webinar series we uploaded. If you're interested in finding out what the perspectives are from the EPB members, we will also be holding a short webinar as a part of the series, but we will announce it in the near future. If you're interested in further information, both about the webinar series and the EPB itself, I request you to subscribe to our mailing list at europeanpolarboard.org. And thank you very much. And I now hand over to Fran Ulmer, who will take up the next talk. Thank you very much. We're just waiting for Fran to join us. Please give us a second because there's there's some technical issues from her side.
Good morning.
Hi, Fran, we hear you.
Oh, excellent. I'm sorry I was having internet issues. My apologies.
No worries, you're right on time. Let's go ahead.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the history of ASM1 and how this all started. And for those of you who do not know, I will just say that ASM1 was the first of its kind, the first time that ministers came together to talk about what they could do collaboratively to bring much more attention to the Arctic region and to understand in a different way how countries could work together. I'm going to read briefly from the opening statement of the ministerial from the September 28, 2016 event. We, the ministers representing the 8 Arctic states, 14 additional states, the European Union, and representatives of the Arctic indigenous communities, have gathered to assert the importance of improving collaborative science efforts in the Arctic. Ours is the first ever effort to convene a meeting of science ministers from around the world to focus on the potential of increased cooperation on Arctic science. Recognizing the significance of environmental and social change in the Arctic region and its impacts on the rest of the planet, we owe this legacy of cooperation to future generations. This idea actually started a year earlier. As you may recall, the United States was chairing the Arctic Council 2015 to 2017, and President Obama went to Anchorage, Alaska, and then on to Kotzebue, Alaska, becoming the very first president to ever go above the Arctic Circle in the US. And the idea after the Glacier Conference in August 15th, 2015, which actually had hundreds of people focusing on this question, how is the Arctic changing? And why does that matter to the world? It was increasingly clear at that meeting in August of 2015, that even though we knew a great deal about the Arctic region, there was even more that we didn't know and needed to know. And because Arctic science work is expensive, it's challenging, it is dangerous, it is necessary for countries to come together, to work together, to better pool their information and work collaboratively to do Arctic science research. So starting in January of 2016, the year of the first ministerial, the National Science Foundation, the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, and the US Arctic Research Commission, which I chaired, began working together to plan the first ASM1. It was very difficult to come to conclusion about the 4 principal areas that we would cover, but after a fair amount of discussion with scientists and from colleagues literally from around the world, it became quite clear that there were 4 main themes that we wanted to address. And I'm not sure if the next slide that you might have shows those 4 themes, but I'll read them very, very briefly. Identifying Arctic science challenges and their regional and global implications, strengthening and integrating Arctic science observation and data sharing, again, under the theory that no one country can do that alone. Number 3, applying scientific understanding to build regional resilience and shape global response. Again, understanding that these changes were impacting the people of the region, the communities of the region, but far beyond that as well. And number 4, to empower citizens through science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM education, to leverage Arctic science, both in the short term and in the long term, building the next generation of scientists and people who could engage meaningfully in understanding this region and its implications. So after the four principal themes were identified, began the process over the next several months of putting together an agenda, of reaching out to the ministers and embassies to discuss the format, to plan a pre-meeting for Indigenous people to discuss some of the ways in which their communities could benefit from such an effort. By June, we had a preliminary version of a ministerial statement, which we began to circulate to the various countries that would participate and the Indigenous people that would be participating to try to get some evolution of a ministerial statement. And we asked each of the participating countries to step forward and provide a two-page summary of what that country was doing in the Arctic science world. Believe me, it was very difficult to get the participating countries to limit it to 2 pages, but we felt that given the large number of participating countries, it was essential to keep that to a minimum so that you could just get a snapshot idea of what was happening from Spain to Greenland, from Russia to the EU. And that challenge represented, even though a very difficult thing for people to do, a useful product from the first Arctic Science Ministerial one. If you want to switch to speaker view, that would be fine. They probably have seen these themes long enough, and I'm happy to talk to people if you want to switch to me. Finally, I just want to say that it was important to be able to bring together the notion of how we would conduct this one day for the ministers to have a meaningful engagement. And most of the ministers said, we do not want concurrent sessions, that is where people have to decide which one to go to. We want all the ministers in the same room at the same time discussing all 4 themes. So we agreed on having international co-chairs for the discussion of the 4 themes. Each country, each group was asked to bring only 3 people, the minister and 2 other people. So there was a delegation of 3 from each. But in a side room at the White House, there was also a spillover area so that people who were not in that ministerial small meeting would have the opportunity to observe and listen. That was a way of keeping Arctic Science Ministerial 1 still sufficiently intimate so that the ministers could discuss these issues with each other and also make short presentations about their country progress in those areas, but yet involve others who were interested, because obviously many people were. I would say that our products were in paper form, a joint ministerial statement, which was a 2-page document and that consensus was reached relatively quickly over the summer. A fact sheet, which basically laid out the various proposed implementations, recommended joint participation opportunities, and some of the deliverables, and the 2-page summary of what each country was doing in the region, and a statement by some of the permanent participants and Indigenous groups that had met a day earlier to provide some insight into how these changes were actually impacting the people on the ground. Those were sort of the tangible products, but the intangible products went far beyond that. And I'll just use one example. Several of the countries came forward with things that they had been either thinking about, planning for, or had already begun, and solicited from the other participants additional engagement. And a great example of that is the Mosaic project. Mosaic, which has just concluded, has obviously, it was many, many years in the planning process, but at the ministerial in Washington, D.C. in September of 2016, it really, hearing about it, and particularly in that environment, gave rise to a lot more enthusiasm and more countries, more money, more scientists, more public and international attention came forward as a result of that. There were other examples like that, but in the interest of time, let me just say, in an effort to emphasize the importance of countries working together to do Arctic science and the opportunity to shine a light on some of the already existing opportunities for countries to do this together, really has raised the game. And we have now seen, as Arctic Science Ministerial 2 that was held in Berlin, which you'll hear about in a moment, as well as the one being planned now, it has really blossomed. It was my pleasure to be one of the US delegates at both Arctic Science Ministerial 1 and Arctic Science Ministerial 2, and now I serve on the advisory committee for ASM3, to see the arc of progress on not only the richness of engagement, the ideas that are coming forward for the collaboration, but also the sense of a joint effort, a unified and important mission to not only each individual country or to the region, but really to the legacy of Arctic science and to science collaboration and cooperation as an important part of keeping the peace in a region that has historically been one of cooperation. So I think I will end there and simply say thanks to all who have participated over the years, to those who may participate this year, and to the organizers of this seminar series, which I do believe illustrates another way in which we are pushing this concept of Arctic science cooperation and collaboration to a whole new level. With that, again, thank you very much, and moving on to ASM2.
Yes, hello everyone. I hope you can see me. Thank you very much, Fran, for giving this very good introduction to the first ASM. And well, I have been one of the German delegates attending the ASM1. I was organizing, well, part of the organizing team of organizing ASM2, and now I'm advisor to ASM3. So we can see how this all has developed. During the ASM1, the European Union and Germany, sort of on the sidelines, discussed that it would be very good to keep the momentum and to actually host a second Arctic Science Ministerial. It wasn't quite clear from the beginning that a second Arctic Science Ministerial should happen. And so the European Commission, Germany and Finland came together, because Finland was at that time chairing the Arctic Council. And as you can see from this slide, it had grown from the ASM1. We had a similar number of countries, also the same number of Arctic indigenous organizations, but in addition, 10 international organizations which joined. We did keep a very similar structure of ASM1 for the ministerial. So we got also the same inputs. We asked the countries to provide us with 2 pages of their Arctic strategy and Arctic ideas and infrastructure and projects. We asked them to indicate which are running projects or planned projects. And we also kept the same format for the ministers to meet. And also at the end, there was a statement. So basically, we kept most of this thing in a similar way, but a few changes did happen. So next slide, please. The themes changed a little bit. We see here as the first theme, Arctic observations, which is similar to the one of ASM1, but we basically drew together the observations, data, and research infrastructure. Then the second one was understanding regional and global dynamics of Arctic change. And this also means that it is not only what is happening in the Arctic itself, but also what are the impacts globally, because other countries worldwide will feel the effect of the changes in the Arctic by changing weather patterns, rainfall patterns, and things like that. And that is one remark. This ASM2 was also had a very strong move to include non-Arctic countries. And I think this is a very important aspect of the Arctic Science Ministerial, that Arctic countries and non-Arctic countries are working closely together, because sometimes the research which is done is coming from non-Arctic countries. And the third topic was, of course, what is the vulnerability in the Arctic countries, but also other countries, and how can we build resilience towards these changes, both in the Arctic environments and in respect to the societies. Next slide, please. Now, it was quite a complex process to build up the really vast amount of input which we got to a joint statement in the end. So you see here the 29 governments plus the European Union. So all these countries submitted their Arctic strategies and also their projects which they are sort of carrying out. We also got input from the indigenous organizations and from the international organizations. So you see here, there were the updates from the ASM1, the 2-page Arctic research overviews from the countries, and also new deliverables which were pledged from the different groups to the ASM1, so new projects coming up. The Science Advisory Board tried to pull all this together to a science summary, and this science summary was then basically fed into the joint statement, saying what is the science we think that is needed, or we suggest that is needed for the joint statement. The next one, please. So this was a, Jenny Baseman made a word cloud of the different themes, of the 3 different themes which we had, because the different research proposals and deliverables were submitted to these themes. And you see quite clearly a few things sticking out very, very strongly. We had data observations, society, ocean in the first theme, which is actually interesting because the terrestrial or the land-based observation didn't show up very strongly here. Also, biodiversity is not very strong. So these are things which are interesting to look at. On the second topic, of course, we have climate change, ocean, sea ice prediction very strongly. And then in the third one, of course, society is very strong, but also indigenous coordination, policy, knowledge, resources. So it just shows in which direction these different topics are formatted in the different countries. The next one, please. This is another change which we introduced. The Arctic Science Ministerial itself was on the 26th of October, but we had an Arctic Science Forum the day before. So on that day, different scientists, representatives from indigenous groups, politicians were coming together to discuss in 3 different sessions the topics, and their input was also then provided to the Arctic Science Ministerial in order to basically have a third voice in this. The next one, please. So these are the 3 sessions which we had. The first one, global implications of Arctic change. That is actually the counterpart to theme 2. So the impact of Arctic change on global weather patterns. Then the second session is understanding vulnerability and building resilience of Arctic environments and societies. That is the theme 3. Here we had a very strong input from indigenous groups and also a very strong input in the direction of education and how one can actually improve the different aspects of education and different efforts of education in a more coherent way. And the third session was observing and data sharing and infrastructure. Now we have to consider that since 2018 things have changed quite a bit, and the topics which we've discussed and the conclusions which we had at that time will have to be reconsidered during the ASM3. That brings me to my last slide, please. These were from the Science Forum actions and recommendations which went into the ministerial. And of course, one of the first points is observations and data are essential. So here we have, of course, the question, how can we bring together the observation platforms in a better way? How can we make sure that the observations are sustained and not just, coupled to a project? Then how can we make the data accessible? And here we said we need support for this implementation. We need actually funding. And one thought I have looking at this now is I think that we see in the present COVID-19 pandemic that it may become more and more difficult actually to go with the ship and do all these observations ship-based. So all this question in terms of automated observations, new technologies, and artificial intelligence come more and more into forefront and may be a very important aspect to be discussed. Then, of course, predictive capabilities have to be improved. There is quite a lot underway in the moment already, and that is very international. So I think we will make quite a good progress in this field. But of course, one can always sharpen it and improve it beyond what we have in the moment. Another point is adaptive strategies. How can we adapt to changes which are unavoidable? And how can we assess risks and basically also find out in which location do we have which adaptive strategy, because that will vary if you are in Greenland or in Alaska, or an adaptive strategy which concerns maybe the more southern parts of Europe and US and Asia. So the knowledge has to be put together, and I think we are not very far on this yet. Research efforts must be co-designed and co-produced with stakeholders, Arctic peoples and communities. This is said over and over again. We have to make a progress here, and we have to come to better co-design. And Mosaic was already mentioned as a good example for a truly international project. I really hope that we can develop more projects like this, where all the countries can contribute. And from my own experience, because I was sort of in the beginning of Mosaic trying to get this off the ground, it needs a country to take the lead. Otherwise it doesn't work. If you just wait for people to come together, it won't work. So if scientists have a good idea and come together, it would be good to have a champion to bring it forward. And if I have a wish to the ASM3, I hope you can come up with another moon landing project for the Arctic. And finally, science education and capacity building is an ongoing thing, and the University of the Arctic and others are something which we can use here and which should be receiving enough support, both in terms of funding and people, to actually go further in this field. Yes, that was basically what I wanted to say. I think you see there is a straight line from ASM1 to ASM2, and this straight line goes on to ASM3, because many things are continuing, and I really think that this webinar is an excellent idea to inform people, to gather input, and I wish you good luck with this webinar series in the lead up to ASM3. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, Fran and Karin, for your kind and insightful review of the Arctic Science Ministerial 1 and 2. As the organizing committee of the Third Arctic Science Ministerial, we received the baton for sure. I'm Hajime Kimura of the Japanese Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, or you can call just MECT for short. For Japan, it is our greatest honor to co-host the Arctic Science Ministerial with Iceland, and we promise to dedicate our best effort for a fruitful discussion on the urgent issues in the Arctic. I'd like to briefly announce the date of the Third Arctic Science Ministerial. The ASM3 was originally scheduled to take place from the 20th to the 21st of this November 2020, just 1 month later from today. However, considering the unpredictable and ongoing global effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we, the organizing committee, had made the decision to postpone the ASM3 to May 2021. The rescheduled date of the ASM3 is from 8th to the 9th of May 2021. The meeting will be held in Tokyo as originally planned. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I just want to quickly introduce the organizing committee of the ASM3. Oh, sorry, previous one. Yeah, thank you. I just want to quickly introduce the organizing committee of the ASM3. From the Japanese Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, next, Hiroyuki Kono and myself, Hajime Kimura. From the Japanese National Institute of Polar Research, NIPR, we have Yuji Kodama and Tetsuo Sueyoshi. From our partner, the Icelandic Ministry of Education, Science, Culture, we have Ásgerður Kjartansdóttir and Lindsay Elizabeth Arthur. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Okay, now I want to hand over to Dr. Tetsuo Sueyoshi of NIPR. He will explain the themes of the ASM3 and its science process. Thank you.
Okay, okay, thank you, Hajime. So, and hello, everybody. I'm Tetsuo Sueyoshi from NIPR, Japan. So for my part, as Hajime introduced, so I will talk about the science process of ASM3. So first, I would like to introduce our big supporter, Science Advisory Board, with 12 members. So the Advisory Board provides consultation on the development of the ASM3 science report, as well as our joint statement. So for the board members, in addition to the researchers from 2 host countries and the representatives from 2 past ASM1 and 2, so you already heard the good summary and review from Frances Urma and Karin Lochte. And we have other members representing different affiliation in some of the organizations for the Arctic science, research, and educations. And we also have 2 members from indigenous communities. So this advisory board reflects what we see the value of ASM3, so the transparency and inclusiveness, and engaging in a bottom-up approach to the science. Can you go to the next slide? So on the theme of the ASM3, so knowledge for a sustainable Arctic is the overarching theme of this ASM3. And these themes are focused on discussing and proposing actions on the most urgent challenges facing the Arctic, which can be met through international scientific cooperation. So reviewing the discussions in the past two Arctic Science Ministerials, we considered the following four-step process is important to meet the challenges of the rapidly changing Arctic. So the first one is observe, so observing the status of the changes. And the second one is understand, so understand the local and global impacts of the changes. And the third one is to respond, so responding to the changes based on a shared understanding, and based on these our knowledge to make a decision for the responding. And for the fourth, so strengthen. So this is to strengthen these efforts through education and capacity building for the next generation, and also for the all steps from observe to respond, to make it more capable to the urgent issues in the Arctic. So these four steps are not independent ones, so but rather an iterative cycle as shown in the figure on the left in this slide. So this represents the necessity, these four steps represent the necessary actions to realize our overarching goal. And as you have seen in the registration page for this webinar series, our webinar topics also follow these four steps in the second half. So it will be explained later. And for this theme, actually a bit more detailed description as a two-page document is available on our ASM3 website. So the URL will be also shown later in this presentation. Can you go next? Yeah, so next I will talk about the participants of the ASM3 and also on the science process. So we have 28 countries and governments and 6 Arctic indigenous representatives and 16 international organizations related to the science or education in the Arctic. So the number of the participating countries and international organizations are slightly increased since ASM2. And we, the organizers, defined our science process as a one-year process, or actually our meeting is postponed, so it is already 1.5 year process. And we have developed several channels for input into the ASM3 science process, so that different sectors of the Arctic community can contribute to this process. And these different input streams will help shape and develop our science report and joint statement to be signed in next May. So for national science programs and also for the international organizations, the formal request for information was sent in last April to these participating countries and all organizations, as well as to the Arctic indigenous organizations. So similar request was sent, and all information arrived to the our organizing committee by end of August, and we started to analyze it. And also, we organizers have also encouraged events during this year, 2020, for the Arctic research communities to discuss and submit their feedback to the ASM3 process. And so these meetings, so 4 international science-related meetings, were trying to bring their statement to the ASM3. But however, as you all know, so COVID-19 has changed our meeting very drastically. So all meetings either moved online or postponed. So part of them are made their statement by the online meeting and submitted already. And the other meetings are made a new meeting alternatively. So Arctic ASM3 Research Committee Workshop, which was held online in June. So coordinating by 3 groups, all together create one document to submit to ASM3. So could you go to the next slide? So this one shows the current status or the flow of the science process. So now we have mainly 3 streams of the information to ASM3. And there, from the request of the information package or these online meetings or online feedbacks, they all come to this ASM3 and create science summary. And together with that, we will create also joint statement. Could you go to the next? So now, Science Advisory Board members are working really hard on analyzing all informations we received. And here I try to show a bit of flavor of our materials. So with the word cloud on the right-hand side, again, we are showing the keywords we are receiving. And you see how many projects were submitted to ASM3 on the left-hand side. So these numbers are based on the information from the countries and organizations. And now for ASM3, we received 360 projects. So the 170 are updates from ASM2 and 190 are new projects. So we are now working on these materials and using this to try to create our science report and our statement. Thanks. So that's all from my side, and I will hand to Lindsay.
All right, thanks so much. So, like I said, I would be back at the end of this webinar to kind of go over what to expect for the upcoming webinars in the series. So really, we designed this webinar series with the intended audience to include not just ASM3 participants, but all Arctic research stakeholders. I think we all are attending a lot more meetings online now, and probably some of us are experiencing fatigue from that. But the benefit here in terms of the Arctic Science Ministerial is that we have this, somewhat private ministerial meeting. And with this webinar series, we're getting the chance to talk to and share the science from this process with anybody who cares about it and wants to be engaged with it. So yeah, we hope to get large audiences for all of these webinars coming up. Basically, the way that we're structuring the webinar series, the ASM3 webinar series will focus on the 4 themes and associated actions for ASM3, and we'll draw on the science submitted through the science process for all of those. But we do have these 2 special webinars planned to happen before that, and they're coming up relatively soon. So in November, we have this Gaps and Barriers in International Arctic Science Research focus webinar, and then we have a Indigenous Peoples focus webinar, and that program is being designed by the Indigenous organizations who are participating in ASM3. And as I said at the beginning, we're doing this in collaboration with the European Polar Board. So we're really grateful that we get to, work on the subject matter and then work with them to help host this series and make it as public and, widely attended as possible. So we can go on to the next slide. So for many of you, you probably registered for this webinar on the ASM3 website. So there's a page just for the webinar series, and we'll be releasing the registration for each series as we go. And so as of now, you can register for the webinar today, and soon we'll open up the registration for the next webinar. And we will also post here the information after each webinar. So the link to the YouTube where there's the recording of the webinar, as well as a written summary from each of the series. So we can go on to the next slide. So the webinar that we have next coming up is a gaps and barriers focused webinar. So that's on November 11th, and it'll be held at the same time as this one, 1 o'clock GMT. So in the past year, several important reports have been released that outline areas where we need more international Arctic research, as well as barriers and that hinder increased international collaboration. So UArctic has contributed widely towards this. IASC's recent report also touches on this. So to build on this knowledge base and include more kind of direct and ministry level perspectives, we included in our ASM3 information packages that we sent out to countries and organizations this survey on international collaboration and cooperation, and trying to get at, understanding like what are the barriers that countries and organizations experience, and how can we kind of take all of that knowledge and try to synthesize it and work towards some solutions. So the Gaps and Barriers webinar aims to summarize all of the various efforts that have been put towards this opportunity, and then we can discuss specific actions that can be taken to overcome these barriers and obstacles. So we're really looking at, we want to kind of summarize what we've learned from countries in this survey that we released to everybody, and then use this webinar to share all of that knowledge. And then hopefully that the webinar can result in a discussion identifying practical actions that can be integrated into the final ASM3 report to fill research gaps and overcome barriers to increased international collaboration. So the next webinar, next slide please, happening in December is an Indigenous Peoples focused webinar. So it's clear that the ASM3 final report would benefit from a focused discussion on ideas and issues directly related to Indigenous developed program on matters related to international Arctic research. And while we hope to include Indigenous voices and perspectives in all of the webinars in this series, we're excited to host this specific webinar in the series completely dedicated to this topic. So we have 2 members on our ASM3 Science Advisory Board representing as an Arctic knowledge holder, that's Liza Mack, and then also representing Indigenous science, and that's Eva Krummel. And we're working with them and all of the Indigenous organizations who are engaged in the ASM3 process to develop a program for this webinar. So we look forward to updating you in the coming weeks with what that program looks like and how you can expect to engage in it. The idea, with both of these webinars happening early in the series is that we can really synthesize some of the learnings from them and integrate those into the final products of ASM3, like into the final report or to influence the joint statement. So that's why they're happening right now. All right, next slide. Next slide. Joseph. Yes, okay. So starting off in 2021, we're going to have 4 webinars in a row. So January, February, March, April. And each of these will cover the 4 themes of ASM3. So just to be clear, by this point in 2021, we'll have completed our science process. So these webinars are really a chance to share and digest the science and the proposed actions for ASM3. But we thought it could be really useful to have this in an open format and share that with, all science research stakeholders. So the structure for each of these will be relatively straightforward. We hope that we can also share some project highlights in each webinar with the projects that we've received that have been reviewed by our Science Advisory Board. And we're looking at projects, that really embody the theme and the spirit of international cooperation. So the structure for each of these will have kind of an introduction to the theme. We'll talk about progress made on that theme since ASM2. Then we'll have these project highlights that we hope to share with all of you, and the proposed actions. And then we hope to have like a moderated discussion with all of the panelists. So next slide, please. All right, this is just, to let you know where the ASM3 website is. Jenny's also put the URL in the chat box for all of you. But this is where you can find out more about the ASM3 process, and we're really trying to keep it updated as we go. And then obviously you can register, for the webinar series here. You can find the key documents like the concept note, the themes, and you can also find, past reports from the previous ASMs. So with that, I just encourage all of you to stay tuned for our next webinar on November 11th. That's going to cover gaps and barriers in international Arctic research. So we're working on the agenda for that right now, and we hope to release the link soon so that you all can register for that. So I think we have time for a few questions and answers, if we can get into that.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think there's a couple of questions that have come up. I think these have partially been answered, but it'll be nice if you can just repeat them for the audience. The first question is about what the timescales are for the different agendas and the lists of speakers for the future webinars. And could you give an idea about when each of the agendas will be released and the time, the speaker list? Thanks.
Yeah, so we're working on all of those right now, and it's we're sort of doing things at the same time because we're reviewing all of the science projects, and then based on what we're reviewing, kind of creating like agendas and topics that we want to cover in each of these series. So we hope to, at least release the registration for them very soon, and then we'll update the ASM3 website with kind of the relevant materials in preparation for this. But yeah, I don't have a solid answer now to give you specific timelines.
Well, I think that's good enough. I think everyone can tune into the ASM and the EPB websites to find further information as these things get planned. The second question was about the science projects that you mentioned also. And it says, it sounds like there are a lot of important science projects that have been contributed to the ASM3 process. Will there be an opportunity for people not attending the meeting to learn about these?
Yeah, so, as Tetsuo showed kind of in the science process for the ASM, we have these final products of the ASM, and a big one is that final report, which is the science summary, which is, a summary of all of the science that we've received through these kind of formal channels of input, and then maybe more information bolstered by this webinar series will also be in that final report. And that's a public document. So once that's complete and we have the ministerial, that's available to anyone, and we'll publish it on the ASM website. And then, as this is now ASM3, we're really working on how to build the legacy data from this entire process. So this is not just now a collection of all the science that's happening, but we can actually track these science projects over time with each ASM. So we're looking at ways to how to share this legacy data, like in a Arctic Science Ministerial focused database or something like that. So that's kind of one of our objectives in this ASM3 process, is how can we make this information more publicly accessible and useful.
Fantastic. I think that sounds like a really good way of engaging a lot more people. The next question is from Tang Hua Li, and I apologize if I did not pronounce the name properly. And they ask, will the ASM3 conference in May be held online?
So right now, I just do want to make a distinction. So what's being planned for May 2021 is the ministerial meeting. So it's not just a science conference. This is a ministerial meeting for ministers. And it was originally intended to happen in November of this year. Due to COVID, we decided to delay it to May 2021. And we're working with all of the relevant ministries as we lead up to that date to make a decision about the safest way to hold that meeting.
Cool. And I think we have one more. Do you anticipate or hope that the webinar series will continue for future ASMs? And it seems like a great idea to share more broadly, as Lindsay suggests. I would definitely support that. What do you say, Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I would too. You know, just even the chance with this webinar to hear both Fran and Karin speak about, you know, the background with the ASMs that came before this one. It's so important to kind of build that legacy knowledge and understanding of this process. So I hope, you know, that future organizers decide to do something similar like this. I think we're constantly trying to find ways for how to share this information with all stakeholders, and to be able to do it in a format that doesn't require anyone to travel is really a win-win. So yeah, we appreciate everyone's participation here, even though, you know, we're all online constantly all day, every day these days.
And one last question that's just come up from Vito Vitale is asks about and if there are any limits to the number of participants in these webinars. And I'm
you go ahead
to answer that.
Yeah.
So there is a limit of 500 people for attendance for this webinars. However, we are recording these webinars, so if in case we do get oversubscribed, the recordings of each of these webinars will be available on the YouTube, on the EPB YouTube channel. So no one is going to miss out, even if we get oversubscribed after 500 people.
Yeah, we would love to have that problem.
Yeah, we've had close to about just above 200 people registered this time, so hopefully we can build up beyond this for the next few webinars.
Yep.
I don't think we have any further questions, and I think we are quite good on time right now. So Lindsay,
Yeah.
any final words from you?
You know, like I said, you see the email address there on the screen, so that goes to the whole ASM3 organizing committee, and we're really happy and willing to take your questions if you have any. Again, you know, this whole Arctic Science Ministerial, as you've understood today, is a relatively new concept. So we're really working on trying to make it, you know, as relevant and useful to as many people as we can, and to really highlight the importance of international science cooperation in the Arctic. So, you know, feel free to reach out to us if you have more questions about this series. And yeah, thank you all for joining us today for our kickoff in the webinar series.
Yep, and I'd like to just join Lindsay and if all of the other speakers in thanking all of you attendees who have made this webinar a great success. Thank you all of the speakers who are esteemed colleagues for your informative lectures, and we'll make all of these webinars available on the YouTube channel. Jenny has put in the email address that is on the screen in the chat box. So if you'd like to copy that across, please do so. And thank you very much, and see you on November 11th.
Yep, see you on November 11th. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.